Welcome to the Outthinkers podcast. Plug into fascinating minds and breakthrough ideas that are transforming industries and the world. I'm your host, Kyan Krippendorf, founder of Outthinker Networks, a global think tank comprised of corporate strategists, innovators, and entrepreneurs that are shaping the future of business. If this describes you, join us at outthinker.com. Now, let's dive into this week's episode.
Innovation begins again when the person who is the innovator or has the potential to be one is confronted with this body of observations, and there's some coherence in those observations, some patterns and regularities. And the best innovators, they begin to make sense of those, they assimilate those regularities, they create competitive advantages, they exploit them in a very natural way. They have the discernment and insight when they see these patterns to be able to make those judgments and move the organization forward.
That was Bruce Vojak, Managing Director of Breakthrough Innovation Advisors and author of two books, No Excuses Innovation, Strategies for Small and Medium-Sized Mature Enterprises, and Serial Innovators, How Individuals Create and Deliver Breakthrough Innovations in Mature Firms. It was Serial Innovators that I read almost 10 years ago that ignited my passion for entrepreneurship and that motivated me to make the 5-year effort to write Driving Innovation from Within. Bruce was formerly the dean and an adjunct professor in the top-ranked Grainger College of Engineering at the University of Illinois, Urbana Champaign. Earlier in his career, he was Director of Advanced Technology for Motorola's non-semiconductor components business, and was on the research staff at MIT Lincoln Laboratory, as you heard in the highlighted clip. And what I love about his work, Bruce brings together real research with real-world practice. And he takes also a more human view of innovation. Your organization's ability to innovate is not just about solving a process problem, the idea pipeline, the portfolio, but it is also a people problem. How do you find and activate what he calls serial innovators? In this podcast, he shares the definition of innovation and how it relates to strategy, how successful innovators view organizational politics and why this is important. The key characteristics of innovators gleaned from years of research and what sets them apart from the rest, how innovators often see patterns others miss, what it takes to be a good manager of innovators. Ladies and gentlemen, Bruce Vojak.
Bruce, it is great to finally have you on the podcast. I have been a long-time follower of your work from Serial Innovators, which inspired me to write one of my books, and it's great to finally have you in person.
Great.
I want to open up with the same two questions that I always begin with. The first is just to get us to know you a little bit more personally. If you could complete the sentence for me, if you really know me, you know that.
Okay, great. I have what I would call a relatively eclectic set of interests and also an eclectic set of friends. I've been kind of inclined to the life of the mind, so I tend to probably think more than act on some things, but I've also experienced my professional life in particular in a real hands-on way. I can illustrate several ways. I've got close friends, 2 are theologians, 1 a successful commercial realtor, and the 4th is a PhD in physics from Princeton, who has been a serial innovator himself.
Wow.
So I tend to just enjoy just being with different people of all backgrounds, and I just find it all fascinating.
So do you 4 get together and converse together simultaneously?
Well, actually, the 2 theologians and I sometimes do, but the others don't even know each other. These are just people that are kind of after a lifetime of getting to know people. They're the ones that have probably stuck the longest with me, if you will. So.
Okay, great. I want to go to the next question. In your case, I'm asked 2 different questions. The first is, what's your definition of strategy? And the next is, what's your definition of innovation? So let's start with strategy. What's your definition of strategy?
Okay. I'll give you parallel definitions for these 2. And when I look at strategy, I think of it in terms of beginning with the body of observations, kind of you might call it data, you might call it even informal data, but it's some body of observations that exhibits some kind of coherence or pattern or regularities. And then the act of strategy, in my understanding, really involves assimilating these and creating competitive advantages, but creating them in a very natural way. So it's really kind of almost a gestalt, looking for those patterns that are out there and looking for ways that one might be able to exploit those. And I believe that an understanding like this really is what should be applied at least first, not other concepts that are great in themselves, things like blue ocean strategy. A great concept, but that there the authors have already, if you will, seen observations or made observations and seen some coherence and regularities and processed them. And I think that it's really incumbent on the strategists to be able to look for those patterns for themselves.
Interesting. I'm going to play back what I sort of got out of your definition and just see if where I'm off or not. There's this seeing the big picture by putting the pieces together in different ways or things that don't seem to go together. And then it sounds like the capability to create your own framework or create your own blue ocean as one example of a framework. Am I on track?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to say it. And let me take a step back and maybe I can dig a little bit deeper on that. And, I'm only using blue ocean strategy as an example. Concepts like that really do have their value. And I've used this argument in innovation. I've used it when it comes to things like phase gate processes. A concept like that is good because it instructs the newbie, the neophyte, and it gives them something to kind of hang on to and look at. And it also reminds the people who are experts that might forget certain things. But the people who are really strategic in their thinking aren't going to necessarily rise and fall just on a concept like that. And it may be considered by some as a tool. I would say that it is, but I would also go further to say that the best strategists, and then as we'll get to, I gather in a few moments, the best innovators see patterns on their own. And that's really when I'd say the exciting things happen.
Yes, got it. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I have gotten to know Renee Mauburn a bit, and I would say she agrees that blue ocean is an important concept, but so is disruption, and so is first mover, and all of these. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just use that as an illustration. Right.
It's just one.
Denigrate any of these things, but it's just to illustrate that, in fact, people like that actually do the work of finding those patterns for a lot of
it. Do the work. Yeah, and hand them to us to use. Let's talk about innovation then. What is your definition of innovation?
Up until recently, I've viewed, and I still view it this way, that innovation is not just creativity, obviously, but it's bringing new products, new processes, new services, new business models to the marketplace in a way where they're valued by the marketplace. And in the best case, I should add, I see innovation as changing the basis of competition, because that's really where you get the most competitive advantage. But more recently, I've been redefining in my own thinking innovation much more parallel to what I said about strategy, and that innovation begins again when the person who is the innovator or has the potential to be one is kind of confronted with this body of observations, and there's some coherence in those observations, some patterns and regularities. And the best innovators, they begin to make sense of those. They assimilate those regularities. They create competitive advantages. They exploit them in a very natural way. And so they're not merely looking at customers, although, things like design thinking is a great concept. They're not just looking at processes. And, again, I think Lean Six Sigma, it's a great concept. They're not just trying to move the organization forward, but they're doing all these things at once. And they have the discernment and insight when they see these patterns to be able to make those judgments and move the organization forward. So it's a more, I'd say, generic or holistic understanding of what innovation is. And again, to me, it's meant to complement things like phase gate and lean innovation and voice of the customer. All, again, good concepts, but those, to me, are born out of observations of the type I'm talking about.
That's what I love about your work. There are certain natural paradigms from which people look at innovation, for example, from starting with the lens of the product or looking at the process and the funnel. And you, in my view, really take this human-centered or people-centered view. You often use this phrase, in the end, it's always about the people. What does that mean?
Yeah, I'd like to illustrate this with a story, and it's got actually two parts to it. The first part, while I was working on the Serial Innovator project with Abby Griffin and Ray Price, I really continued to look at the question that got me involved in the research in the first place. And it's a question that's kind of haunted me since I was in graduate school. And that's, how do the most impactful innovators know what to do? I've had the good fortune of working side by side with some remarkable people I think I was a very good engineer, but not, if you will, at the innovative impact that a lot of these other people have. I've always wondered, how do they see this? And throughout our research, actually, we would hear people talk about connecting the dots. And I see these fuzzy dots. And so they would talk this way. And I would always think in my mind, fuzzy dots, connect the dots. I would think in terms of like constellations in the sky, that you'd see the dots and then you would draw lines to connect them, or the children's books that would just have a set of dots that were numbered and you would connect them. And I would say, yeah, it's a pattern. You connect the dots. That's right. And that's all good. But at the time that I was working on the Serial Innovator project, I happened, for entirely other reasons, to be reading a book on epistemology, which is the philosophy of knowledge, what we know and how we come to know. And in the middle of this book, I came across an illustration that is remarkable. And it's a book called Longing to Know by Esther Meek. I want to be sure to give her credit for this. But she talked about how the act of knowing, or the act of discovery, is a lot like viewing a magic eyes image. And if you've seen these children's books where there's kind of a page or all sorts of dots and colors, and if you look at it just right, if your eyes are not focused on the sheet but focused beyond, suddenly you no longer see the two-dimensional image, but in your mind's eye, you see this three-dimensional pattern. And it just hit me. It just hit me that I realized that this was a much better illustration or metaphor for how these innovators come to see things, that it's not merely seeing dots, two-dimensional dots on a two-dimensional page, two-dimensional lines. They see something richer and deeper. And, unless you're looking for this, unless you're, again, with these Magic Eyes books, unless you're looking for it, unless you know to look for it, you'd miss it. And so, after I had that insight, I thought, okay, I'm going to go back to some of the people that we had met with, and I'm going to ask them this to tell me, how do they know what to do? I was a little more explicit than our research. And it turned out that one of the innovators happened to be visiting campus at that time, and she and I were having lunch, and I posed the question. And without looking up from her meal, she said, "I see dead people." Now, I don't know if you probably have seen the movie.
Yes.
Yeah, at that time, I had not. And let's just say that I was taken back a bit. And I'm kind of thinking to myself, who is this woman? And I knew her very well. So this is not like, but it was kind of this sense of, what is she talking about? I see dead people. And, that conversation opened the door. That first part of the conversation opened the door to me, a very remarkable discussion about how she would, early in her career, see patterns that other people either didn't see or she'd see them before them. And she had to kind of develop through that time frame to accept and realize that, yes, she really was seeing things that other people weren't seeing. And I'm not trying to make it like dead people. I mean, we'll use that as the metaphor, but she was seeing patterns, and she was right much more often than not. And so she had to develop both the confidence in that, and then also accept the responsibility, this idea that we talked about in the Serial Innovators book of crossing the bridge, accepting the responsibility that when she saw things like that, whether it was in the marketplace, whether it was in the organization, that she had the responsibility to the organization to lead them through that.
Because they don't necessarily see the dead people.
That's right. That's right.
Got it.
And I jokingly tell people that in innovation, you just have to it's kind of like running away from a bear. You just have to be faster than the other guy. You just have to see the patterns, a little bit quicker. And I'm not heavily into the idea of, you have to always be moving rapidly. It just has to be better. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing with forecasting weather. And I think especially forecasting weather, because it's a complex, mathematically chaotic system, I think there's a lot of parallel to what we see.
Fascinating. So then let's pull on that a little bit more, and let's look at this serial innovator. And first, I'd like you to tell us what a serial innovator is, because I haven't yet asked you to define that. And then the question will be, what are the characteristics of the serial innovator? Because, we often think of innovators as looking like, like Steve Jobs, or, wearing a hoodie, or Mark Zuckerberg or something, as you're wearing a college, a turtleneck like you. So first, what is a serial innovator, and who are they?
Yeah, the initial study began of looking at people who were in large mature companies. And in fact, I'd say that really all of my work has been with people in mature companies in essentially mature industries. So, I've not done research with people, as you mentioned, I haven't done research about Apple or Amazon or the like. But I have looked at companies that have been around for a while and sell products that I'd say were probably considered technology enabled more than technology based. And again, as a little bit more background, just for a moment, I began looking at what I called technical visionaries, because I was trying to answer this question of how do these people know what to do? How do the visionaries know what to do? And I ran into Ray Price on campus. I shared it with him. He had some experience asking similar questions. We started to collaborate. And as a side, a story that we don't tell often, but Ray and I actually met Abby Griffin, who was about a mile away from us, through someone at the National Science Foundation in Washington. We didn't even know that she was working on something equivalent, market visionaries. And so with that as the background, we're looking at what I'd call technical visionaries. She's looking at market visionaries. When we started to collaborate, we realized that there were these people out there, and they, in large mature companies, that would repeatedly create and deliver breakthrough innovations. And it was not a fluke. It wasn't just a one-time thing. In fact, when we were talking to somebody at one company, she shared, we always knew we had people like this. We didn't know anybody else did. And so there was this pattern, again, going back to what I'd been talking about before, there's this pattern of people who are out there that really can have, significant, billion-dollar impact on multi-billion-dollar companies. And as I subsequently saw over time, these people also exist in mid-market companies too, the ones that are successful.
That's your second book.
The second work that I did, yeah. Now, getting back to what do these people look like, kind of a handy way that we use to describe them is how they engage with problems. They're very curious systems thinkers. How they engage with projects, they're appropriately tenacious. They're not stubborn, but they carry things through to a logical point. They engage appropriately with business. For technical people in particular, it's important to say in a large company that they realize the business is there to create value. And remarkably, there are still some who miss that. And they value people. They are ones who quickly bring along the right team. And we probably don't have time to discuss this in depth now, but they don't necessarily work with a preformed team, but they bring the people onto the project, that are necessary to solve the problem. And so they kind of have these characteristics. They also really care about navigating the organization because they realize that's probably as big a problem as coming up with a good idea. And then the other thing I'll just mention is that we also looked at people who manage them and how important it is to have a manager or executive that I'd say appropriately supports them.
Okay. Well, what does that mean, appropriately supporting? That's I'm very curious about that. What does it take to be a good manager of Serial Innovators?
Very often we found the innovator and their direct manager working together for many years. And it meant that they had very much a relational, not a transactional engagement necessarily. And very often the manager had to understand just how light or firm a touch to interact with these people, what that would look like. And so the ones who tried to micromanage would tend to fail. The ones who really didn't provide any support would tend to fail. The best ones, it really was this relationship where they understood that the serial innovator, because of their unique skill set, that person was someone who would be able to drive value in the organization much more than they would as an executive or manager. And so they realized, we talk about servant leaders. I mean, this challenges that concept of servant leadership to the point where they do have to, in a way, submerge their own ego because they realize that for the best of everybody, they're getting resources for this person. Doesn't mean they don't challenge them. Doesn't mean that everybody's let to run wild.
Right.
But it really means that they're there to help make things happen.
Yeah, see, I'm hearing a very different relationship between manager and managed as opposed to this is my successor. This is the person who's learning to do what I've already done and that eventually will take my role. This is much more like a manager, like a talent manager who's never going to be the star themselves. Yeah. Fascinating. Now, one phrase that I pull from your book, and I use it, if anyone's heard one of my speeches, I use it in every speech. They view the political challenge as part of the problem-solving process. Something like that, you said. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, it's interesting because they not only passively accept the challenge, but they realize that if they want to serve customer needs, they're going to have to navigate the organization. And so they realize that it's not just coming up with an idea and throwing it to someone. I've seen a lot of, quite honestly, frustrated and bitter people who had throughout their careers come up with some really good ideas, but never carried them through. The people who were most successful, assumed that responsibility. And we kind of metaphorically refer to it as crossing the bridge, that they cross this bridge of accepting that personal responsibility. And it's what makes them rare. I'll add quickly that when you look at all these characteristics that I've spoken about earlier, plus this, it really is the whole set. You can't necessarily succeed without that. And at times, pairs can make things happen, whether it's two innovators together or a manager-innovator pair. But for the most part, you have to have all these characteristics. And unfortunately, I've recently seen some companies try to shortcut this and say, well, you don't really need all these characteristics. No, it really, the ones who succeed all pretty much look the same.
Interesting. So if I were to peek inside the head of a typical executive and ask them about politics, it might sound something like this. It's a necessary evil. It hated. It shouldn't be here. But I have to learn to do this just to get anything done here. If we were then crack open and listen to inside the heads of a serial innovator, what might they be saying?
Yeah, they might say pretty much the same thing in some respects. Because again, their goal is they're there to serve all these other people. And while they maybe didn't use that phrase, you think about it, they really are there to solve customer problems first and foremost. But they do so in a way that also addresses management's concerns. They do so in a way that clearly, addresses shareholder needs and also their colleagues. People keep their jobs and succeed through things like this. So they remarkably, and I don't want to make them sound like fiction by saying all these things, but they really do address a lot of different needs by doing this. So, most but not all, don't necessarily come to it wanting to be involved in these political things, but they realize it as a necessity. And as kind of an aside, I don't know if you've heard this before, many of the people we interviewed were engineers, but you can tell when an engineer is an extrovert because they're looking at your shoes, not their own. And so it's somewhat, I don't want to say painful for some of these people, but it's not natural for many of them.
Gotcha. That is a great metaphor. Great. I have many more questions than we have time for, so I'm just going to narrow down just a couple. Bruce, talk to us about why you decided to work on no excuses innovation.
Sure. Going back for several years now, living in the Midwest where there are a large number of small and medium-sized companies, I've over time met with a lot of people in a lot of these companies, and many of them, for lack of a better way to say it, are uncomfortable with investing in innovation. And by that, I don't mean huge projects. I mean even asking simple questions. Many have done things that are unfortunately have failed. Many are frustrated. Many just fear the whole idea. And so I began to get increasingly concerned about local and regional economies, national economies. And as a quick aside, I've actually been in contact with some people in Germany, and there's a whole group of German companies called the Mittelstand that are experiencing some of these same patterns. And so I, with Walter Herbst, felt that we wanted to do something to help the owners, to help the management, to help all the employees. It really does affect the economy. And so the book is a different kind of book. It's something more of a guidebook. I'd say it's unique in that it does not assume an audience that would be interested in innovating. So the very first chapter is addressing, the question, why innovate? And I've actually been speaking on that topic as much as anything else lately, because it's a question that a lot of people ask. And so this is the kind of book that go through the argument as to, why should you do this to survive and thrive and to not get stuck in a downward spiral of cost reduction as a strategy. And it's the kind of book that if you're in a company that there are pockets of people of resistance, buy a copy and give it to them. If you're working in a company when the owner isn't sure about it, buy a copy and give it to. Tell them just read chapter 1.
Yeah, I love it. Yep, I think all of our listeners will value that, to be able to convince people that innovation is worth it. So in addition to that book and Serial Innovators, what is another book that strategists should read?
There was this great little book that I was assigned to read when I was in business school. The book's published in 1986, so by now it's almost 40 years old. It's called Strategies of Competitive Success by Robert Pitts and Charles Snow. It's a Wiley book.
Excellent.
And it's a little paperback, and it is the most condensed, powerful book I've ever read. And I believe in simplicity, and this book is in the best sense simple. Maybe some examples are outdated, but to me, that's the go-to idea.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. I'm going to get that book as well. So, Bruce, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with you for your dedication to activating and standing for serial innovators in the world. And thank you for spending some time to share some of those insights with us.
Thank you to our guest. Thank you to our executive producer, Karina Reyes, our editor, Zach Ness, and the rest of the team. If you like what you heard, please follow, download, and subscribe. I'm your host, Kyan Krippendorf. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you soon with another episode of Outthinkers.